What's going on, everybody? Welcome to episode 14 of the Black Massacre series, where today I will be discussing the Atlanta race riot or massacre of 1906. Violent reprisals by armed mobs of white Americans against African Americans in Atlanta, Georgia began after newspapers on the evening of September 22, 1906 published several unsubstantiated and luridly detailed reports of the alleged rapes of 4 local women by black men. The violence lasted through September 24, 1906. The events were reported by newspapers around the world, including the French Le Petit Journal, which described the lynchings in the USA and the massacre of Negroes in Atlanta. The Scottish Aberdeen Press and Journal under the headline Race Riots in Georgia, and the London Evening Standard under the headlines Anti-Negro Riots and Outrages in Georgia. The final death toll of the conflict is unknown and disputed, but officially at least 25 African Americans and 2 whites died. Unofficial reports range from 10 to 100 black Americans killed during the massacre. According to the Atlanta History Center, some black Americans were hanged from lampposts, others were shot, beaten, or stabbed to death. They were pulled from streetcars and attacked on the street. White mobs invaded black neighborhoods, destroying homes and businesses. The immediate catalyst was newspaper reports of 4 white women raped in separate incidents allegedly by African American men. A grand jury later indicted 2 African Americans for raping Ethel Lawrence and her aunt. An underlying cause was the growing racial tension in a rapidly changing city and economy, competition for jobs, housing, and political power. The violence did not end until after Governor Joseph M. Terrell called in the Georgia National Guard, and African Americans accused the Atlanta Police Department and some guardsmen of participating in the violence against them. Local histories by whites ignored the massacre for decades. It was not until 2006 that the event was publicly marked on its 100th anniversary. The next year, the Atlanta massacre was made part of the state's curriculum for public schools. After the end of the American Civil War and during the Reconstruction era, there was violence of whites against blacks throughout the South, as whites reacted to emancipation of blacks, accusations of black criminality, and political empowerment of freedmen, specifically gaining the voting franchise, which led to political power and representation. Having former slaves become equals was threatening to their ideals of racial supremacy. Increased tensions also resulted from whites competing with blacks for wages and the idea of paying for labor, which had been free for centuries. Atlanta had developed rapidly, attracting workers for its rebuilding, and particularly from the 1880s as the rail hub of the South. Workers from all over the country began to flood the city. This resulted in a dramatic increase in both the African American population, which went from 9,000 in 1880 to 35,000 in 1900, and the overall city population from a population of 89,000 in 1900 to 150,000 in 1910. As individuals from rural areas and small towns sought better economic opportunities. With this influx and the subsequent increase in demand for resources, race relations in Atlanta became increasingly strained in the crowded city. Whites expanded Jim Crow segregation in residential neighborhoods and on public transportation. Freedmen and their descendants had gained the franchise during Reconstruction, and whites increasingly feared and resented their exercise of political power. African Americans had established prosperous businesses and developed an elite who distinguished themselves from working class blacks. Some whites resented them. Among the successful black businessmen was Alonzo Herndon, who owned and operated a large refined barbershop that served prominent white men. This new status brought increased competition between blacks and whites for jobs and heightened class distinctions. The police and fire department were still exclusively white, as were most employees in the city and county governments. State requirements from 1877 limited black voting through poll taxes, record keeping, and other devices to impede voter registration, but many freedmen and descendants could still vote. But major candidates played on racial tensions during the campaigning for the gubernatorial election of 1906, in which M. Hoke Smith and Clark Howell competed for the Democratic primary nomination. Smith had explicitly campaigned on a platform to disenfranchise black voters in Georgia. Howell was also looking to exclude them from politics. Smith was a former publisher of the Atlanta Journal, and Howell was the editor of the Atlanta Constitution. Both candidates used their influence to incite white voters and help spread the fear that whites may not maintain the current social order. These papers and other attacks saloons and bars that were run and frequented by black citizens. These dives, as whites called them, were said to have nude pictures of women. The Atlanta Georgian and the Atlanta News publicized police reports of white women who were allegedly sexually molested and raped by black men. Historians and contemporary commentators cite the stage production of The Klansman by Thomas Dixon Jr. in Atlanta as a contributing factor to that city's race riot of 1906, in which white mobs rampaged through African American communities. In Savannah, where it opened next, police and military were on high alert and present on every streetcar going toward the theater. Authorities in Macon, where the play was next to open, asked for it not to be permitted, and it was not. On Saturday afternoon, September 22, 1906, Atlanta newspapers reported 4 sexual assaults on local white women allegedly by black men. A grand jury later indicted 2 for the rape of Ethel Lawrence and her niece Mabel Lawrence. Following this report, several dozen white men and boys began gathering in gangs and began to beat, stab, and shoot black people in retaliation, pulling them off or assaulting them on streetcars beginning in the 5 Point section of downtown. After extra editions of the paper were printed by midnight, estimates were that 10,000 to 15,000 white men and boys had gathered through downtown streets and were roaming to attack black people. By 10 p.m., the first 3 blacks had been killed and more were treated in the hospital, at least 5 of whom would die. Among these were 3 women. Governor Joseph M. Terrell called out 8 companies of the 5th Infantry and 1 battery of light artillery. By 2:30 a.m., some 25 to 30 blacks were reported dead, with many more injured. The trolley lines had been closed before midnight to reduce movement in hopes of discouraging the mobs and offering some protection to the African American neighborhoods, as whites were going there and attacking people in their houses or driving them outside. Alonzo Herndon Barbershop was among the first targets of the white mob, and the fine fittings were destroyed. Individual black men were killed on the steps of the U.S. Post Office and inside the Marion Hotel, where a crowd chased one. During that night, a large mob attacked Decatur Street, the center of black restaurants and saloons. It destroyed the businesses and assaulted any black people within sight. Mobs moved to Peter Street and related neighborhoods to wreak more damage. Heavy rain from 3 a.m. to 5 a.m. helped suppress the fever for rioting. The events were quickly publicized the next day, Sunday, as violence continued against black people and the massacre was covered internationally. Le Petit Journal of Paris reported black men and women were thrown from trolley cars, assaulted with clubs, and pelted with stones. By the next day, the New York Times reported that at least 25 to 30 black men and women were killed, with 90 injured. 1 white man was reported killed and about 10 injured. An unknown and disputed number of black people were killed on the street and in their shops, and many were injured. In the center of the city, the militia was seen by 1 a.m., but most were not armed and organized until 6 a.m. when more were posted in the business district. Sporadic violence had continued in the late night in distant quarters of the city as small gangs operated. On Sunday, hundreds of black people left the city by train and other means, seeking safety at a distance. On Sunday, a group of African Americans met in the Brownsville community south of downtown and near Clark University to discuss actions. They had armed themselves for defense. Fulton County Police learned of the meeting and raided it. An officer was killed in an ensuing shootout. 3 militia companies were sent to Brownsville, where they arrested and disarmed about 250 blacks, including university professors. The New York Times reported that when Mayor James G. Woodward, a Democrat, was asked as to the measures taken to prevent a race riot, he replied, "The best way to prevent a race riot depends entirely upon the cause. If your inquiry has anything to do with the present situation in Atlanta, then I would say the only remedy is to remove the cause. As long as the black brutes assault our white women, just so long will they be unceremoniously dealt with." On September 28th, the New York Times reported, the Fulton County grand jury today made the following presentment. Believing that the sensational manner in which the afternoon newspapers of Atlanta have presented to the people the news of various criminal acts recently committed in this county has largely influenced the creation of the spirit animating the mob of last Saturday night, and that the editorial utterances of the Atlanta News for some time have been calculated to create a disregard for the proper administration of the law and to promote the organization of citizens to act outside of the law and the punishment of crime. Resolved that the sensationalism of the afternoon papers in the presentation of the criminal news to the public prior to the riots of Saturday night deserves our severest condemnation. An unknown and disputed number of African Americans were killed in the conflict. At least 24 African Americans were believed to have been killed. It was confirmed that there were 2 white deaths, one a woman who died of a heart attack after seeing mobs outside of her house. On the following Monday and Tuesday, leading citizens of the white community, including the mayor, met to discuss the events and prevent any additional violence. The group included leaders of the black elite, helping establish a tradition of communication between those groups. But for decades, the massacre was ignored or suppressed in the white community and left out of official histories of the city. The New York Times noted on September 30th that a letter writer to the Charleston News and Courier wrote in response to the riots, "Separation of the races is the only radical solution of the Negro problem in this country. There is nothing new about it. It was the Almighty who established the bounds of the habitation of the races. The Negroes were brought here by compulsion. They should be induced to leave here by persuasion." The New York Times analyzed the population of the 10 states in the South, with the most African Americans, 2 of which were majority black, the 2 others nearly equal in populations, and the African Americans totaling about 70% of the total white population. It noted practically the difficulties if so many workers would be lost in addition to their businesses. As an outcome of the massacre, the African American economy suffered because of the property losses, damage, and disruption. Some individual businesses were forced to close. The community made significant social changes, pulling businesses from mixed areas, settling in majority black neighborhoods, some of which was enforced by discriminatory housing practices well into the 1960s, and changing their social patterns over the years. In the years after the massacre, African Americans were most likely to live in predominantly black communities, including those that developed west of the city near Atlanta University or in eastern downtown. Many black businesses dispersed from the center of the East, where the thriving business districts known as Sweet Auburn soon developed. Many African Americans rejected the accommodationist position of Booker T. Washington at Tuskegee Institute, believing that they had to be more forceful about protecting their communities and advancing their race. Some black Americans modified their opinions of the necessity of armed self-defense, even as many issued explicit warnings about the dangers of armed political struggle. Harvard-educated W.E.B. Du Bois, who was teaching at Atlanta University and supported leadership by the talented 10th, purchased a shotgun after rioting broke out in the city. He said in response to the carnage, "I bought a Winchester double-barrel shotgun and 24 rounds of shells filled with buckshot. If a white mob had stepped on the campus where I lived, I would without hesitation have sprayed their guts over the grass." As his position solidified in later years, circa 1906 to 1920, Du Bois argued that organized political violence by black Americans was folly. Still, in response to real-world threats on black people, Du Bois was adamant about the legitimacy and perhaps the duty of self-defense, even where there might be a danger of spillover into political violence. Elected in 1906, Governor Hoke Smith fulfilled a campaign promise by proposing legislation in August 1907 for a literacy test for voting, which would disenfranchise most blacks and many poor whites through subjective administration by whites. In addition, the legislature included provisions for grandfather clauses to ensure whites were not excluded because of lack of literacy or the required amount of property, and for the Democratic Party to have a white primary, another means of exclusion. These provisions were passed by constitutional amendment in 1908, effectively disenfranchising most blacks. Racial segregation was already established by law. Both systems under Jim Crow largely continued into the late 1960s. After the Great War, World War I, Atlanta worked to promote racial reconciliation and understanding by creating the Commission on Interracial Cooperation in 1919. It later evolved into the Southern Regional Council, but most institutions of the city remained closed to African Americans. For instance, no African American policemen were hired until 1948, after World War II. The massacre was not covered in local histories and was ignored for decades. In 2006, on its 100th anniversary, the city and citizen groups marked the event with discussions, forums, and related events such as walking tours, public art, memorial services, numerous articles, and 3 new books. The next year, it was made part of the state's social studies curriculum for public schools. Well, this is going to conclude episode 14 of the Black Massacre series. If you would like a recap of all the other previous episodes before this one, make sure to check out the Black Massacre series playlist that is available at your disposal. And be sure to tune in next Wednesday when we do episode 15 of the Black Massacre series. Stay safe and be one.